In Genshin Impact, there is this very big misconception that you should be running Iron String on your Kazuh, and that would be a giant mistake, at least for most of you out there. Today we're going to be talking about common misconceptions on Kazuh, as well as doing some myth busting about crit versus elemental mastery, Iron String versus FAV. But most importantly, we're going to explain why Iron String is a terrible choice for your Kazuh and stop doing this. While some players out there like to run crit on their Kazuh to do a big punch damage, in general, you always should be running full elemental mastery build on Kazuh. Not only because it provides a buff to your teammate, which is very significant in terms of your overall team damage. The truth is, elemental mastery on your Kazuh just does more damage than crit because swirl is a really strong reaction ever since the 1.6 Genshin Impact buff. As long as your Kazuh is level 90, building him full elemental mastery to do a swirl build, it will be significantly better than doing a crit build, even on a personal damage basis. And if your Kazuh is not level 90, well, consider getting him to level 90 because transformative reaction only scale off character level as well as your elemental mastery. And so what you can do is actually skip out on all your talent and don't waste resin on any of this, and instead just farm EXP book to level up your Kazuh instead. I think a lot of people out there don't understand how swirl work and doesn't understand why it is strong. So let's do a very quick overview of how swirl really works. Starting off on your Kazuh, there is a 90% chance that you should be equipping the 4-piece FAV set, as it will decrease the enemy elemental resistance by 40% and it will dramatically help your teammate dish out big elemental damage. One of the bigger problems with Anemo DPS in Genshin Impact is that they don't have a method to decrease opponent elemental resistance to Anemo aside from using C4G. However, little do people know that swirl actually does that element damage accordingly. So if you swirl a electro, you actually do electro damage. What that means is that the swirl damage can actually benefit from the elemental resistance decrease from the VV4P set, since the first time you swirl electro, it will decrease opponent elemental resistance to electro by 40%, and then the second time you swirl electro, that swirl will do electro damage, which will do more damage because their electro resistance has been decreased. And that's one of the contributing factors to why swirl does so much damage compared to Anemo damage, is because you don't get the benefit of the 4-piece VV set for Anemo damage, but you do get it for elemental damage, which is what swirl does. In Genshin Impact, enemy not only have elemental resistance to element, but they also have another defensive stat called the defense. You will be able to see these on things like Constellation 2 rather, where it will ignore the opponent defense, and currently there is only a few methods of either shredding or ignoring the opponent defense. Swirl being able to ignore defense is actually really massive. The way defense is calculated in Genshin Impact, it is actually based off your level as well as the opponent level. The higher the opponent level gap is, the less damage you will actually do. The damage you will do to a level 90 enemy versus a level 100 enemy will actually be different. And so in the overworld, when you're fighting trash enemy that are like level 50, level 60, you might notice that you do a lot of damage, but once you go to the abyss and start fighting level 100 enemy, that damage from your plunges will drop dramatically. However, this is not the case for transformative reaction because they ignore defense, so they are able to do full damage even to enemy that are level 100, which are of course what appear in floor 12 of the Spiral Abyss. And other thing that a lot of people don't understand about swirl is there's actually a secret trick to make your swirl to double the amount of damage or even triple the amount of damage. Let's say I apply electro to this crowd registry right here, and then I do a elemental skill. You will see there is electro number, which is the electro swirl. So let's quickly apply electro on one of these Hilichos, and then let's apply electro on this Samatro. So now both of them have electro, and if I do a swirl, you notice that 2 electro number pop up at once instead of just 1 on each enemy. That is because when you swirl, it will spread to your adjacent enemy, and your adjacent enemy will spread that damage back. So when you are fighting 2 or more enemy, your swirl will actually automatically hit twice every single time, and therefore effectively double the amount of swirl damage that you have. But something cool about Hydro is that you can actually do electric charge, which maintain both electro and hydro. In this case, when you have electric charge and you do a swirl, not only it will swirl twice on the electro component, it will also do an additional swirl on the hydro component as well, effectively making it so that every single time you swirl, you will swirl 3 times compared to the initial 1 time only, which is how you can triple the amount of damage on your swirl. Kazuh is able to do a really huge amount of swirl. Pretty much any single time you do Anemo damage, it will also react with the element to do swirl, and so you you will have 2 swirl on your elemental skill, 1 during the suck, and then finally 1 during your plunge. And then your elemental burst will actually swirl 6 times in total, 1 during the initial cast of the flash, and then 5 times during the actual elemental burst tick, making it so that you can get a lot of swirl in a single rotation, and this does a lot of damage. Generally speaking, if you're fighting single target enemy where you can only swirl with 1 times damage, then crit kazuh could be a little bit better than EM kazuh in terms of personal damage, but it's not unfair to say they're about the same. However, anytime you're fighting 2 target or more, elemental mastery kazuh will do way more damage than crit kazuh, and if you're able to get triple damage on your swirl by doing easy, well, elemental mastery kazuh will outlead crit kazuh by a significant amount. And all of those does not include the buff that he give his teammate, because when you build elemental mastery, you can give your teammate a significantly bigger buff so that your teammate can also just do more damage. In general, elemental mastery on kazuh will outperform crit kazuh significantly. So if you really want your kazuh to perform, you should always build elemental mastery and never crit, unless you're just doing some for fun build like for the plunge damage. With that being said, let's finally answer the main question of today, and that is why you should be running Thornius Sword on your kazuh instead of Iron String. To be honest, the answer is quite simple. That is because Thornius Sword gives energy recharge, and you really need energy recharge on your kazuh. While kazuh Elemental Burst doesn't have the biggest energy cost, it is still quite costly at a 60 energy cost, especially since he's a quick swap character where you just kind of cast his elemental skill and swap out. But most importantly is that when you're running kazuh, you will pretty much always be running him as a solo Anemo character, so you have no other character to generate Anemo energy for your kazuh, and therefore, generally speaking, you will be lacking on energy recharge on your elemental burst. In general, you want to be casting your kazuh elemental burst as frequently as possible, usually ideally off cooldown or on a 20-second rotation depending on the team you're playing. Anything longer than that, you will be suffering a huge DPS loss, because not only kazuh elemental burst does a lot of damage through swirling as we previously explained it, but it also just have a lot of benefit, including the fact that you can absorb elemental, which can help supply additional element like hydro for your other character like Hu Tao. But because it will also swirl off field, which will continuously proc your A4 passive to continuously supply elemental damage bonus to your other party member. So it is essential that you are making sure that you are able to cast your kazuh elemental burst as often as possible. One of the example of elemental absorption being really useful is actually in Raiden Hyper Team, which a lot of people also don't notice. By doing a pyro absorption on your kazuh elemental burst with the Bennett elemental burst infusion, you are able to make a pyro absorb elemental burst on kazuh, which will then react with the electro applied it with Raiden on the enemy, and that will cause you to do overload on your kazuh, who you should be building full elemental mastery on, because overload actually does a lot of damage when you're building full elemental mastery. In a Raiden Hyper Team, kazuh actually does a significant amount of damage as well that is quite hard to notice. Kazuh is able to do 17% of the overall team DPS, even though he's providing a significant electro buff to both Raiden and Kujo-Sara. Scrolling down here, you can actually see what we were previously talking about. You can do a lot of electro swirl in this team, which is a lot of damage, as swirl just does really good amount of damage. But additionally, you actually proc a lot of overload thanks to the elemental burst infusion on pyro on kazuh. But kazuh elemental burst is actually even more important than that. Aside from the fact that it is able to do really good amount of damage, as well as continuously supply your team with the A4 buff, which will allow the rest of your team to continuously do even more damage, kazuh elemental burst can actually be very useful to set up what we know as the double swirl VV, which is very essential, because not only when you swirl 2 element, that means that you get 2 elemental damage bonus, so that if you are ever running a party with 2 elemental damage dealer, then they will both be able to benefit from the kazuh A4 buff. But additionally, because you're equipping the 4-piece VV set, enemy elemental resistance to both elements that you swirl will be decreased, so the 2 character of the corresponding element can do further damage. damage. Now do know that of course it is entirely possible to get double swirl without needing Kazuh elemental burst through specific setup. However, in general, having Kazuh elemental burst to do double VV swirl is just significantly easier, and in some team composition or setup it is straight up not possible to double swirl without the use of Kazuh elemental burst. And so it is highly advised that you have your Kazuh elemental burst ready to do it. We're gonna cover the basic as well as the advanced of double VV swirl in the next upcoming future video. So this is an important time to call if you are not already subscribed to the channel. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and of course like the video as well. Coming into the energy calculator using the exact same team as the same example international, with a 24-second rotation on the international team, you can actually see that you need about 200% energy recharge on your Kazuh in order to cast his elemental burst on time. And depending on the team you're playing, depending on the setup that you're doing, you might actually need even more energy recharge. So Kazuh definitely need to run energy recharge to ensure that his elemental burst is cast on time. If you're able to get 2 Phoneus proc per rotation, this even drop all the way to 160, which is exactly enough from just a level 90 Phoneus sword. So that means that in this particular setup here, with a Phoneus sword, you can cast your Kazuh elemental burst on time pretty much always, in addition to reducing the energy requirement on your party member as well. And without it, well, you're gonna have to run 200 energy recharge, which is like a ER Sans plus a lot of energy recharge substat, which is going to be very hard and it's going to be very inefficient to farm for. For example, within all 3 pieces, you can actually see that I only got a single row of energy recharge that gave me 4.5 energy recharge. And in this case, it is just not very feasible for me to find energy recharge in my substat unless I explicitly farm for it. Now, of course, it doesn't mean that Phoneus sword is always the best in slot option. If you happen to be running with Raiden, which lower your energy recharge by a lot, or you somehow have infinite ER from your substat, then you can definitely run the Iron String instead. I have seen players with Kazuh with 200% energy recharge just purely from substat. In that case, because they have so much energy recharge already, yes, the Iron String is better for them. However, for many players out there, you should be aiming for the Phoneus sword, especially since the Iron String passive is completely useless because it doesn't correspond to any of the damage component that a sword Kazuh can do. And if you're playing a crit Kazuh, then elemental mastery substat is not useful, and so it is one or the other. Of course, the other concern that most players have when it comes to run a Phoneus weapon is that their Kazuh doesn't have high enough crit rate to proc the Phoneus sword. But that is actually also a misconception. While it is true that you do need to crit to proc the Phoneus sword, you can actually get away with really low critical rate on Kazuh, and it's actually extremely easy to proc the Phoneus sword. To illustrate this, I actually went ahead and made a graph to explain it to you. In this graph, we have a couple of formula, but the one you need to pay attention to is R, which represents your Phoneus sword refinement, and H, which represents the amount of hit you can get in. So for example, if you normal attack the enemy once on your Kazuh, you do 1 hit, and at a refined 1 Phoneus with 100% critical rate, you will have a 60% chance to proc the Phoneus sword, which is what you would expect as those are just the baseline number. However, the important factor here is that as we increase the refinement on our Phoneus sword and amount of hit we get, our chances actually can improve dramatically. Let's suppose that we have a refined 3 Phoneus sword and we do a very basic EQ Kazuh combo on 2 enemy, where you do a Yi to suck both of them in, and then you do the plunge, and finally you cast his elemental burst. How many hits can we get in, and what is the probability to proc the Phoneus sword given, like, let's say 15 to 30% critical rate, which is not very high? Let's quickly count the amount of hit in this example where we're fighting 2 enemies. Starting with a Kazuh elemental skill, of course we have 2 damage instants that can crit. In fact, this one already critted. However, this is 2 hits in total. And then coming into the plunge, we first do the pyro damage component. Both of these can individually crit. This is another 2 hits. And of course, we have the 2 Nemo damage component here as well, which can also crit, which is gonna be 6 hits in total. Of course, we're also able to get the plunge collision damage, but that is quite unreliable, so let's not count that. And then coming into our Kazuh elemental burst, once again, this hit both enemy, which has a initial anemo component that can crit. Right here, this one crit again. So that is another 2 hits for a total of 8 hits. And then we did 1-2 Kazuh normal attack on this enemy for a total of 10 hits. Our Kazuh elemental burst then immediately ticked it, which does swirl damage to both of these enemies, and it actually does 4 damage inserts in total. It first does the absorption damage, which is 2 pyro damage, 1 to each enemy, which is represented by this 535 pyro number to both enemy. And it also does this 1-2-4-9 anemo damage, which is the actual anemo component of the elemental burst to both enemy. So in total, in this elemental burst tick, there were 4 instances of damage. So in total, how many instances of damage did we get? We were fighting 2 enemy and doing a very basic Kazuh EQ combo. We were able to get 14 damage instance in and 16 if you count the collision plunge. So with a refined free Phoneus sword at about 20% critical rate, you actually have a 90% chance to trigger your Phoneus sword passive. And if you're a 30% critical rate, which my Kazuh currently have 27 critical rate, so about here. At a 27% critical rate, you have a 96% chance of triggering the Phoneus sword. And if you have a 30% critical rate, it's a 97, and basically guarantee at 35 or higher than that. And this is with a refined free Phoneus sword. If you're like me and you have a refined 5 Phoneus sword, doing that exact combo previously, even at a 20% crit rate, already give you a 95% chance to trigger the Phoneus sword, basically guarantee every single time. And my critical rate might be a little high since I do have critical rate from some of my artifacts, like my feather has 3%, and my flower has 7%, but getting to about 20 to 30% critical rate is dramatically easier than trying to get a lot of energy recharge on your VV artifact. And so triggering Phoneus sword is honestly not as hard as you might think. In fact, I want you to go and take a look at your Kazuh build right now and look at how many critical rate are you at. Are you at, let's say, 20%? Are you at 15%? Or maybe you're at 30%? By the way, by default, you start at 5%. Even at a 15% critical rate, you still have a 90% chance of triggering the Phoneus sword if you have it at refined 5. And of course, the more enemy that you're fighting against or the more attack that you do, your chances will start going up and up, because each enemy that you start introducing will dramatically increase the amount of damage instance you can get in. Right there, we're fighting 2 enemy, but if we're fighting like 3 enemy, well, you will have like a guarantee FAV proc even at a 15% chance or something like that. Those are a couple really important factors of why Phoneus sword is the best in-slot weapon for Kazuh, because his elemental burst is just very important, and so you really need the energy recharge to batter him, but also his entire team as well through the Phoneus passive. One of the very common questions that people ask is, should I run Phoneus sword over Freedom sword? And to be honest, I would recommend Freedom sword if you already have it anyway. Then using Freedom sword over Phoneus sword on Kazuh is fine. If you don't already have Freedom sword, then you probably should just stick to Phoneus sword, because the Freedom sword banner is quite bad. If Freedom sword ever come on a really good banner, then it's worth considering. But on this banner, honestly, do not go for the Freedom sword. Just run the Phoneus sword. To be honest, it is super amazing. You really need to be using the Phoneus sword right now. Hopefully throughout this video, you realize the importance of running Phoneus sword on Kazuh, because, well, elemental mastery build on Kazuh is just really strong. Kazuh elemental burst is just really strong and really important, and therefore you want to make sure that you have enough energy recharge on Kazuh, and running Phoneus sword on Kazuh is just the easiest way to achieve that while being one of the best options, as it can further help battery the rest of your team. Keep in mind that, again, as we just mentioned, triggering Phoneus sword is not as hard as most people think. Most people out there think you need really high crit rate to trigger it, when in reality, you don't at all. And hopefully this answered the question of why Phoneus is significantly better than Iron String on Kazuh, and pretty much every single player out there should be running the Phoneus sword instead of Iron String, which is by far the most common noob mistake that people are making out there right now. If you do exactly know what you're doing, like you know that you are going to run rotation the boss and you don't really care about his burst, or you just have enough energy recharge from subset already, then Iron String is still a considerable option. But for the other 95% of the player base out there, you really should just consider running Phoneus sword first. But with that being said, that's pretty much it. If you're not running a Phoneus sword already, don't forget to run a Phoneus sword. And of course, most importantly, if you're not subscribed already, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. As always, like the video as well, leave a comment below, help with the algorithm, and I'll see you all next time.